The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the open highway. It was the kind of evening where the world seemed to slow down, where the hum of engines and the chirping of crickets blended into a kind of symphony. But for Sarah, the quiet was about to shatter. She had pulled her car into the parking lot of a roadside diner, craving a cup of coffee to break up her long drive. Dressed in a simple leather jacket and jeans, she looked like any other traveler passing through, her unassuming presence blending seamlessly into the sleepy atmosphere of the evening. She wasn't looking for trouble. She never did. But trouble, as it so often did, seemed to have a way of finding her. The rumble started faintly, like distant thunder rolling in from the hills. Then it grew louder, closer, until the ground seemed to vibrate beneath her feet. A group of bikers roared into the parking lot, their motorcycles gleaming under the fading sunlight. There were 6 of them, big, burly men with leather vests, tattoos snaking up their arms, and an air of authority that made people instinctively step aside. The diner's patrons glanced nervously at the newcomers, lowering their gazes and avoiding any unnecessary attention. But Sarah didn't flinch. She stood by her car, her arms casually crossed, watching them without a hint of fear. She wasn't trying to provoke them. She was just observing. The bikers noticed her almost immediately. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and a scar running down his cheek, exchanged a smirk with his friends. "Looks like we've got ourselves a tough one," he muttered loud enough for her to hear, his voice dripping with mockery. Another chimed in, "Think she's waiting for someone to save her." They laughed, a deep booming sound that echoed in the parking lot. Sarah still didn't move, her expression unreadable. "Hey, sweetheart," the bearded man called out, swaggering toward her. "This ain't exactly the safest place to be standing around all alone. Maybe you should find someone to look out for you." His words were a thinly veiled threat, his tone laced with condescension. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "I appreciate the concern," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But I'm doing just fine." The man's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "You got a lot of nerve, lady. You even know who you're talking to." Another biker stepped forward, eager to escalate the situation. "Yeah, maybe she needs a little lesson in respect." The tension in the air was palpable now, the kind that made bystanders hold their breath. The bikers' laughter had faded, replaced by a kind of predatory curiosity. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her, a lone woman with no visible backup. But Sarah didn't back down. She met their stares head-on, her gaze unwavering. There was something about her, something the bikers couldn't quite put their finger on. It wasn't arrogance or bravado. It was quiet confidence, the kind that made them uneasy without knowing why. "I'm going inside," she said finally, her voice steady as a rock. "Enjoy your evening." With that, she turned and walked toward the diner, leaving the bikers standing there, their egos bruised and their tempers simmering. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As she stepped through the diner's door, the bell above it jingling softly, the bikers exchanged glances. "Who does she think she is?" One of them growled, his hands curling into fists. "She's got guts, I'll give her that," another muttered. "But let's see how far that gets her." Inside, Sarah took a seat at the counter, ordering her coffee as though nothing had happened. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, glanced nervously at the parking lot. "You sure you want to stick around, hon? Those guys don't usually let things go." Sarah smiled politely. "I'll be fine." The waitress hesitated, then nodded and poured her coffee. Outside, the bikers were gearing up for round 2, their frustration boiling over into something darker. They weren't going to let her walk away so easily. Not without putting her in her place. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Sarah wasn't just any ordinary traveler. She had faced bigger threats and walked away unscathed. And the next move she made, it would leave them speechless. The tension in the air was thick as Sarah sat at the counter, sipping her coffee as if nothing outside mattered. Her calm demeanor was almost unnerving to the few other patrons who had witnessed the exchange in the parking lot. The waitress moved about nervously, stealing glances through the window at the bikers, who hadn't gone anywhere. Their motorcycles still idled in the lot, their riders talking amongst themselves, their movements agitated. One of the patrons, a middle-aged truck driver with a salt and pepper beard, leaned closer to Sarah. "You sure you're okay, miss?" he asked in a low voice, his concern genuine. "Those guys aren't known for playing nice. Best you just drive on before things get ugly." Sarah glanced at him, her expression softening for a moment. "I appreciate it," she said, her voice steady but kind. "But I've dealt with worse." The man frowned, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to push the issue. He muttered something under his breath and went back to his meal, though his eyes kept darting toward the parking lot. The rest of the diner's occupants did much the same, trying to focus on their food but failing to shake the unease that hung over the room. Outside, the leader of the bikers, the one with the scar, was pacing now. His boots scraped against the asphalt with each step, his agitation growing more visible by the second. "She thinks she's better than us," he muttered to one of his buddies, his voice a low growl. "Walking in there like we're not even worth her time." Another biker, a wiry man with a shaved head and a sly grin, leaned against his bike. "Maybe she's got something to hide," he suggested, his tone conspiratorial. "Nobody stays that calm unless they've got a reason." The scarred man stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he considered this. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but either way, we're not letting her get away with disrespecting us." Back inside the diner, Sarah set her coffee cup down and glanced out the window. She could see them clearly from where she sat, their posturing, their frustration. She could read their body language like an open book. They were angry, yes, but there was something else there too, a hint of insecurity, of fear. They didn't understand her, and that made them uneasy. The waitress approached again, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled Sarah's cup. "You seem awful calm for someone with that kind of trouble outside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah met her eyes and gave a small, reassuring smile. "Calm is all I've got," she replied. "Panicking never solves anything." The waitress hesitated, then nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. She glanced toward the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The bikers, meanwhile, had come to a decision. The scarred man barked out a few orders, and the others nodded, their movements purposeful now. They weren't leaving. Not yet. One of them, the wiry one with the shaved head, even made a show of revving his engine, the roar of it cutting through the still evening air like a warning. Sarah noticed the shift immediately. She could feel the eyes of the entire diner on her now, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "What are you going to do?" But Sarah didn't move. She finished her coffee, calmly set the cup back on the counter, and pulled out a few bills to cover her tab. Then she stood, adjusted her jacket, and walked toward the door. The bell jingled as she stepped outside, and all eyes turned to her. The bikers straightened up, their expressions a mix of smug satisfaction and anticipation. They were waiting for her to crack, to stumble, to show any sign of weakness. But she didn't. She walked toward her car, her steps steady and deliberate, her face unreadable. "Hey," the scarred man called out, stepping forward to block her path. "You think you're just going to walk away from us?" Sarah stopped, her gaze locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The air seemed to hold its breath. "I don't recall agreeing to stay," she said finally, her tone as calm as ever. "Now, if you'll excuse me." The scarred man's smirk faltered. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially not like this. He took a step closer, invading her space. "You got some nerve, lady," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't just walk away from the Steel Fang Brotherhood." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Steel Fang," she repeated, her tone neutral. "That's creative." The wiry biker snickered, but a sharp look from the scarred man silenced him. "You think this is funny," the leader growled, his fists clenching. "I think," Sarah said evenly, "that you're used to people being scared of you. and I think it bothers you when they're not." The scarred man's face darkened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it looked like he might take a swing at her, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she stood, perfectly still but perfectly balanced, like she was ready for whatever came next. Or maybe it was her eyes, calm, unflinching when piercing, as though she could see right through him. Behind him, the other bikers shifted uncomfortably. They could feel it too, that something about her wasn't quite right. But none of them dared to speak. Sarah's voice softened, though it lost none of its edge. "Walk away," she said, "before this becomes something you regret." The scarred man hesitated, caught between his pride and the knowing sense that he was out of his depth. His hand twitched at his side, as if considering a move, but he stopped short when Sarah shifted ever so slightly, a stance changing just enough to make it clear she was ready. "You've got guts," he admitted grudgingly, stepping back. "But don't think this is over." Sarah didn't reply. She didn't need to. She simply turned, got into her car, and drove away, leaving the bikers standing in the lot, unsure whether they had just won or lost. Inside the diner, the patrons watched her leave with a mix of relief and admiration. The waitress, still clutching the coffee pot, shook her head. "I don't know who that woman is," she muttered, "but she's something else." As Sarah's car disappeared down the highway, the bikers stood in silence, their leader's scowl deepening. "We'll see about her," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. And as the night closed in, it became clear that this was far from over. Whatever had just happened was only the beginning. As Sarah's car vanished from sight, the bikers lingered, a heavy silence settling over them. The sound of their engines had faded, but their anger hadn't. The scarred man's fist tightened around the leather of his vest, his knuckles white. His crew hovered around him, uncertain whether to challenge his authority or simply let it go. "She's just a woman," one of the younger bikers said, his voice edged with doubt. "She's got guts, but she's nothing special." But the leader, the man they called Riker, shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "No, you didn't see her, did you? That woman, she's not like the others." He gritted his teeth, staring into the distance, as if searching for something. "She's got a fire in her, and I don't think we've seen the last of her." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke up. Riker was a leader for a reason. He had a way of reading people, of sensing when something was more than it seemed. And that woman, she wasn't someone they could brush aside. There was a reason she had walked away without fear. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he was certain of one thing: they weren't done with her. Inside the diner, the atmosphere hadn't lightened. The truck driver who had spoken to Sarah earlier had barely touched his food, his eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds. The waitress had gone back to her tasks, but remained visibly anxious, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. It was clear to everyone that the tension was far from over. The bikers might have retreated for now, but their pride had been wounded, and wounded pride often led to dangerous things. "Do you think she's going to be okay?" the truck driver asked, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might bring the bikers back in. The waitress sighed. "I don't know. I've never seen someone stand up to them like that. Most folks just bow their heads and hope they go away. But her, she wasn't afraid." It was the not being afraid part that gnawed at them both. It wasn't just courage, it was a calm, a readiness. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't just some innocent traveler passing through. There was something more to her, something hidden beneath the surface. Outside, Riker was pacing again. The others had mounted their bikes, but none of them were eager to follow Sarah's car. Not yet. They had questions, and no one knew the answers. They'd seen a lot of things in their years of running with the Steel Fang Brotherhood. They'd never seen someone handle them quite like this. The fact that she was alone, that alone made her different. "I'm not letting this go," Riker muttered to himself, kicking at a rock in frustration. "She's not just some local tough. She's something else." One of his men, a younger biker named Jake, spoke up. "You sure we're not just making this bigger than it is? We scare some people, they get all tough for a minute, Then they back off when they see we're not playing around. Riker stopped pacing, his eyes flashing. You think she's scared of us? No, you can't get it. She's not scared. And that makes her dangerous. Jake shifted uncomfortably. So what now? We go after her. Riker didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the asphalt, his mind turning over the possibilities. We watch. We wait. We find out who she really is. Back at the diner, Sarah's thoughts were far from the bikers. As she drove down the highway, the wind whipping through the open window, she didn't even glance in her rearview mirror. There was no need. She knew they'd be watching, just as she had known they wouldn't leave without making some kind of move. They were predictable that way. But what troubled her wasn't the bikers. What bothered her was how easily they had underestimated her. How they had assumed she was just another victim waiting to be intimidated. Sarah wasn't new to the game. She had learned a long time ago that people's assumptions could be dangerous. They didn't know her. They didn't know what she was capable of. The truth was, Sarah had been running from something for years. She wasn't just some random traveler, and she wasn't anyone's damsel to save. Her life was a series of calculated moves, and when it came to keeping a low profile, she had perfected it. She could blend into any crowd, disappear into the night, and keep her secrets close to her chest. But the Steel Fang Brotherhood, they were different. They weren't just bullies, they were persistent, relentless. They would follow her for as long as it took to figure out who she really was. Sarah knew she'd have to move quickly. She couldn't stay on the highway for much longer, not with them looking for her. They'd be getting smarter, piecing together her behavior, her actions. She needed to get ahead of them, to disappear before they closed in. But even as she thought about all the possible places she could go, places she could hide, there was one thing she couldn't shake, the nagging feeling that the bikers weren't just chasing her because of some fleeting moment of pride. They were after something more. As she made her way through the winding roads, Sarah's mind raced. Who had tipped them off? Who had known she would be passing through this area right when the Steel Fang Brotherhood had made their presence known? There was too much about this situation that didn't add up. She had made enemies before, but they usually weren't this persistent. She made a sharp turn onto a secluded road, her tires kicking up dust. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it was out of the way, at least for now. She needed time to think, to plan. But as she parked her car behind a dense line of trees, she caught a glimpse of something in her rearview mirror. A flash of movement, too fast to be anything natural. And just like that, she knew they were already here. They hadn't followed her directly. They had set up a perimeter, anticipating her every move. The hunters were closing in. Sarah gripped the wheel, her jaw clenched. This wasn't just about pride anymore. They had made it personal. And now, it was time for her to make a move.